Greetings and salutations, friends. So, the Lizardmen army. Quickly, before I actually start in on the unit, I'll explain some of the unique attributes of the Lizardmen, as they have quite a few actually. First up, the most obvious one is that being lizards, they have the cold-blooded special rule, which in tabletop means that all Lizardmen units can roll 3 dice and choose the 2 lowest dice for their leadership test, whether they break or flee, while everyone else only gets to roll 2 dice. Now, since Total War of course doesn't use dice rolls, this should probably just be represented by the fact that they've got really high morale, because, well, stuff like Saurus warriors and Kroxigors, they're closer to robots than, humans. They fight because they've been told to fight. They don't really ever consider the idea of running away unless they are, well, so horribly outnumbered or outmatched that they revert to their baser animal instincts, the basic instinct of survival. So they should have an absolute ton of morale, which is, well, that's pretty much how they work anyways in tabletop, because they are a very grindy melee army. Then you have something that might be, well, relatively easy to implement, I suppose. It depends on how they're going to do the armor system. It's the scaly skin special rule. Essentially, this is an armor save that stacks with other armor. So if you've got a chainmail, set of chainmail for example, and you put that onto a Lizardman, then the armor save from the chainmail will get added onto the save from the scaly skin. The vast majority of the Lizardmen don't actually use armor of any real sort, so for the most part their scaly skin save is their only save, but it's still a reasonably good armor save. And this can be relatively easily modeled in-game with just an armor save. Hopefully, I would like it if you've got some blacksmiths, essentially. Now, granted, the Lizardmen don't really use armor for the most part, but they have been known to actually manufacture and use them on occasion, so having the option to upgrade your Lizardmen with better armor could be really cool, and that would give you a really well armored, and solid fighting unit. Then you've got predatory fighters. This one's a little strange in Total War terms, because the way it works in tabletops is that every time your Saurus or Kroxigors rolls a 6 to hit, they get to make another attack. But only one. So if you roll a 6, you get another attack, but if you roll another 6, that doesn't mean you get yet another attack, because, well, that has the possibility of being pretty damn ridiculously broken in tabletop terms. Now, in Total War terms, I'm a little bit... they're probably... if they want to actually implement this as a rule, they're probably gonna have to do something with the engine itself, allowing the unit to get a bonus attack or something along those lines every time it gets a critical or something like that. If they don't want to be bothered by adding in that as a special rule, they could simply just give them a slight bump in their attack power, and that would more or less serve to represent the predatory fighters rule. But, of course, it also has a little bit of a drawback. Since the vast majority of the Lizardmen army's fighters, like the Saurus and Kroxigors, are essentially giant meat-eating predators, if you presented them with a readily garnished dinner table in the form of an enemy unit, and said enemy unit decides that they don't want to be the main course and runs away, the Sauruses will probably follow them. You could relatively simply represent this in-game with a berserk special rule, so that basically if a unit actually runs, they have to follow them, but it's not like they're completely berserk. They don't really become more vulnerable because of this. They still have all of their basic fighting instincts intact, it's just that they're not going to let their two-legged side dish run away from them. The last special rule is aquatic. Now, this only pertains to skinks. It doesn't work for Sauruses or Kroxigors because, well, they're too big, essentially, to really make use of aquatic's primary rule. Because while aquatic means that they could be swimming around in the ocean and stuff, In tabletop, it's mostly used for crossing rivers and marshy terrain. In tabletop, the effect this has is essentially that the skinks will jump into the bog or the river or whatever and submerge themselves, which means that it's a hell of a lot harder to hit them with ranged weapons. And they gain the Steadfast special rule, which means they're even harder to break, because, well, they have the home team advantage, so to say. In Total War terms, this could be a little bit odd. I mean, of course, if you're gonna have a bridge battle, you could just simply allow the skinks to, cross the river, nothing wrong with that, but it's a somewhat limited rule. I would really like it if they completely redo the engine and actually allow us some form of terraforming magic. Perhaps just before the battle starts instead of during the battle, because I can see why that could be overpowered. But say, for example, that before the battle starts you can cast a particularly powerful spell that requires some sort of resource, and that spell allows you to add in a bit of marshy terrain on the map, for example. Could be cool, could be interesting, and would allow the skinks to make use of their special rules, and would be very handy for many other races. For example, extremely shooty armies could create a bit of marshy terrain in front of their main position, forcing the enemy to either spend time going around the marsh, or potentially bog themselves down in the marsh and get shot to pieces. Bit of interesting stuff. Of course, this should be able to be dispelled pre-battle, so, could be an interesting thing, but it's going to require a complete rework of the engine, so, well, it's pure speculation at this point, as is, well, pretty much everything I do here, but, yeah. Well, that's it for their special rules. Some interesting ones might be a bit problematic to implement, but most of them should be relatively simple. Moving on to their characters. First up, we of course have the Slann Mage Priest, the biggest, baddest potential artillery piece in your entire army, as they have access to every single lore of magic. Now, I'm aware that probably doesn't tell you much, but, well, I'll see if I can work in a magic video at some point in the future, though, as I have already said, I am quite busy at the moment, so don't expect it right away, but I'll get to it eventually. The Slann Mage Priest does have a few other nifty abilities though, for example the fact that even the smallest Slann is a level 4 caster, the biggest and baddest there is, with a built-in 4+ ward save, which means that even if you shoot this guy with a cannonball, there's a 50-50 chance that he just simply swats it out of the air with a bit of magic. And he can be your army's general and the battle standard bearer at the same time, so he has the potential to be absolutely ridiculously buffed up with magical items. Plus, well, as you can see on that fancy little pedestal he's got there, he essentially levitates, so he ignores all terrain penalties. He's got 5 wounds, so he's pretty damn tough. Well, he's not particularly tough, but he will take a bit of a beating, simply because his magic allows him to sustain himself through things that would just normally kill anything that looks like that. He has the ability to swap spells with other Slanns on the battlefield, which can be extremely handy, and he can cast spells through friendly skink priests. Now, this is a really interesting one, because essentially this allows you to put the Slann Mage Priests way back in the battle lines and still have him be able to cast spells with full effect, as long as you've got a relay priest in the middle. Now, again, this depends on how they're going to do magic, or if they're even going to bother to do magic. If they just make the Slanns an artillery piece, then he should have an absolutely stupendous amount of range. If they do magic, well, he can essentially relay that magic via priests, which could be really damn interesting indeed. Additionally, since the Slann Mage Priests are essentially the hive mind that control all Lizardmen, any unit he joins becomes stubborn and immune to psychology, so they cannot be frightened, they cannot be scared in any way, they cannot be forced to route through magic. And since he deploys in the 2nd rank, not the 1st, as his unit are essentially considered to be bodyguards, he's not going to have to be fighting in melee combat either, because of course he's not particularly good at that. And he can cast spells even while his unit is fighting. And as such, he is, bar none, the finest mage in the entire game. However, Of course, there is one tiny drawback, namely his price tag. A Slann mage priest costs 300 points, unupgraded, with no disciplines, no magical trinkets, no nothing, which makes him one of the most expensive single models in the game. But unlike most other big, badass, expensive models, the Slann Mage Priest comes with a built-in ward save to save him from artillery fire, and since he is, well, essentially one of the biggest, baddest mage artillery pieces in the game, he will regularly earn his points cost right back again. But that, of course, is in tabletop. How do you actually implement something like this in Total War? Well, first up, they should be ridiculously rare. I would actually kinda prefer if you started the game with one Slann Mage Priest. He is your patriarch, he is the leader of your faction, and the only way you're ever going to get other Slann Mage Priests is if your current guy dies, in which case you start over with a basic level 1 Slann Mage Priest, lacking all of the magical trinkets and stuff you've given to your older one. Of course, you should be granted some additional Slaven Slann Mage Priests via events or doing particularly well, like if you're given a fairly hard quest, for example, and you complete that quest, a potential reward might be a Slann Mage Priest, but they should never ever be recruitable, simply because they are that stupendously rare and that stupendously powerful. And of course, while in most cases I would like to see characters being able to level up into bigger, badder characters, you should never ever be able to level anything into a Slann Mage Priest. A Skink Priest is never going to actually be able to level into a Slann. That's just not how it works, so it wouldn't work with the Slanns. And since his, implementation basically depends on how they're going to do magic, I'm not going to speculate too much on that. I just wish that Creative Assembly would get their thumbs out of their little bumholes and actually announce the bloody game so I could start proper speculating. Give me a screenshot or something and I will analyze that thingy to death. Anyways, moving on, we have the Saurus Old Blood. Now, the Saurus, as they are essentially immortal in terms of aging, and since they have an instinctive understanding of warfare that only grows the older they get, you can imagine that a Saurus Old Blood, a Saurus that has been around for a couple hundred years, is pretty ridiculously good at fighting. In fact, if you put this guy on a Carnosaur, which is that giant-ass dinosaur you can see right there, and tool him up properly, this bastard can actually take on Chaos Lord level characters and greater demons. Hell, he can take on entire infantry regiments by himself if you kit him out properly. And of course he's a pretty damn good general with a +4 scaly skin, so give the bastard some proper armor and you've got a nigh-on invincible, invulnerable, unstoppable killing machine. However, here's the main downside. He doesn't have a ward save, which means that one good cannon shot could kill your gigantically powerful, extremely dangerous kitted up Saurus Old Blood, which is painful to say the absolute least. Now, of course, the Slann Mage Priests have access to a fair variety of spells that actually do give ward saves, so, if you're willing to invest the magical firepower in him, and assuming Creative Assembly even allows us to have defensive magic, he can be a ridiculously powerful unit. A favored build is giving him 2 more magical items, the Armor of Destiny and the Fencer's Blades. This means that one Saurus Old Blood gets 6 attacks, which is usually more than that of an entire unit can pump out, at strength 5, equal to that of an ogre, and at weapon skill 10. Which means that, a normal human is weapon skill 3, a trained professional human soldier has weapon skill 3, so you can imagine what 10 is like. This guy makes high elf swordmasters look like newbies. And it gives him that much needed ward save and a +2 armor save. which makes him, well, he's nigh on unstoppable in melee. However, he is almost certainly going to be the primary target of any opponent that's ever ran into a kitted out old blood before, so expect the cannonballs to come flying. The Saurus Old Blood should of course be allowed to be a level upable thing. It should be the maximum level of Saurus. So you start out with just a Saurus Warchief, I'd probably call him. Now, the Saurus Warchief is not an actual thing. The one that is below the Saurus Old Blood is the Saurus Scar Veteran. But, so we have a 3-level system, kind of. You start out with a Saurus Warchief, you level him up into a Scar Veteran, and then finally a Saurus Old Blood. At which point, you can still use him as your army general, of course, but with that kind of killing power, it's almost a shame not to use him as a nice big badass threshing machine. Moving on though, the Saurus Scar Veteran, which is essentially just a slightly smaller Old Blood at a considerably more affordable price point. And since they are a fair bit more, achievable, I suppose, it's a hell of a lot easier to get a Scar Veteran than it is to get an Old Blood in all due likelihood. So you could risk them a fair bit more freely, which means you can't kit them out as dedicated melee units, while with the Saurus Old Blood, while you certainly want him to be getting into the thick of it and butchering stuff, you need to be a little bit careful about his deployment, since you don't want to lose the crazy bastard. Scar Veterans are a little bit more disposable, and should therefore be used almost like a missile weapon. Pick an enemy unit or hero you want dead and send the Scar Veteran after it, and he'll probably get the job done. Of course, there are also solid choices for generals, so if you want a little bit of extra command power, they're perfectly up to the task, and they are very, very good at lending extra killing power to nice big fat units of Saurus warriors. Then we have something that's a little bit more subtle. We have the Skink Chief. This one is mostly based on its choice of mounts. You can mount it on a Stegadon, in which case he's essentially just a big-ass monster unit. He's a bludgeoning assault unit, or you can put him on a Terradon, which is essentially a pterodactyl, which gives him some incredible mobility, which is a wonderful thing, considering a lot of the Saurus units will actually be looking into the Skinks for leadership. And it makes him an absolutely amazing war machine hunter, because since he's got a ranged attack, he doesn't necessarily have to land. Now, how they would actually implement that in a Total War game, I'm still not entirely certain. They could simply allow him to kind of circle an area of the battlefield and use his ranged attack, but, he's pretty far up, so it's pretty damn hard to actually hit him with missile weaponry. Like, there is a reason why modern anti-aircraft weapons use explosive ordnance to pepper as large an area as possible. It's just simply pretty damn hard at hitting something that high up, moving that fast. But, of course, that would also make him stupendously overpowered, as well, there's not a whole lot of modern AA in the Warhammer world. So, I'm not honestly entirely sure how they would implement this guy. I'd kinda like a bit of a strafing system, where, he can essentially bombard an area with a relatively low-strength strafe attack. He's not going to be doing much to ranked up units of infantry or anything, but he'd certainly be able to harass war machines relatively effectively. And you could defend the war machines by, placing a couple of archer units near the side to try and scare him off. Essentially, if you can hit him once, the Skink will automatically basically go like, regardless of whether he was wounded or not, the Skink flying will go like, oh shit, and break off. Little bit gamey a mechanic, sure, but just to try and have it relatively balanced. You can also take him on foot with a ranged weapon and have him lead your Skinks, although, considering your Skinks is a bit of a cannon fodder unit, meant to be a bit of a distraction and to be put in relatively dangerous positions, I wouldn't recommend it. And then, of course, we have the ever-wonderful the Skink Priest. The Skink Priest is a pretty damn good low-level wizard, relatively cheap, relatively good lures, but of course their primary advantage is the fact that they can channel spells from their Slann overlords. So, if anything, the most numerous characters in any Lizardmen army should really be the Skink priests. Using their buffing skills and their general leadership to bolster your front ranks and improve the abilities of your already quite impressive melee units. And of course acting as relays from your more powerful Slanns. Onto the core units, we of course have the humble, the cheap, the spammable Skinks. The Skinks are the perfect light infantry unit, really. They're cold-blooded, so they don't break and run all that often. The Skinks are a wonderfully flexible little unit, as you can equip them with a wide variety of ranged weaponry along, like javelins and blowpipes and even short bows. But they can also, surprisingly enough, be a relatively powerful melee unit. And this is not so much due to the Skinks, but the fact that you can actually take units of Skinks with Kroxigors in the second rank, which are allowed to attack above the heads of the Skinks. This allows the Kroxigors to use the Skink's leadership, which is considerably higher, and keeps them more or less immune from stupidity tests, and it gives them a little bit of a soft squishy meat shields to put in front of them, and it gives the Skink unit a bit of an extra melee oomph. Now, in a Total War game, I would really like to see a mixed unit. I'm not entirely sure if that is even possible with the current engine, but we'll see. Where you have the Skinks filling up the front ranks with Kroxigors behind them, allowing both ranks to attack simultaneously. Would be a really cool melee unit. And of course, Skinks are primarily used in a skirmishing role, with javelins and blowpipes and these kinds of things, and they're damn good at being skirmishers. They're pretty damn fast, they've got good skirmish formation, they're small, they've got a little bit of a scaly skin save, so while relatively vulnerable to missile fire, they're so fast and skittish that they're actually not that vulnerable to it. They will out-skirmish quite a few other races. They're of course going to struggle a bit with dedicated skirmishers a la elves, or Skaven assassins, but in these cases they can usually actually outnumber their opponents, since most of these other races skirmishers are special or rare units, while the Skinks are core, so if you wanted to, you could take an entire bloody army of skirmishing little Skinks, with tons of poisoned weapons and etc., which could certainly be interesting. And of course, while their role as pre-battle skirmishers is pretty obvious, they can of course also melt through Saurus units pretty damn easily, being nice and small, and thereby get onto your enemy's flanks and cause all sorts of havoc with javelins and blowpipes and poisonous weapons. However, they have one minor drawback, namely the fact that even their javelins, well, they're being wielded by fairly small Skinks, and so they're not really javelins, you know, as we know it from our own history. They're far smaller, and their blowpipes, of course, are, well, even tinier, and their short bows are, well, also tiny, and so they really struggle against units with lots of heavy armor. A unit of Empire Knights, for example, would be close to invulnerable to the vast majority of firepower the Skinks can actually put into them. And Chaos Warriors would quite literally just laugh at it as it plinked embarrassingly off their armored forms. So they should have exceptionally low armor piercing, and in this case I am meaning low armor piercing as in actual low armor piercing, not as in Attila Total War armor piercing, where a unit that is supposed to have low armor piercing still kills like 30 dudes of the most heavily armored unit in the game. No. Proper low armor piercing. Please, Creative Assembly. Please, I beg of you. But they should be able to make up for this with just the sheer amount of fire they'll be able to put out, as their blowpipes and short bows, you know, they're pretty damn quick to fire, especially as they're fired by someone who has been firing them for a fair bit of time. Moving on, we of course have the backbone of the Lizardmen army, the Saurus Warriors. Your average Saurus Warriors packs a +5 scaly skin save with a shield and spear or melee weapon, and 2 base attack, which means that they weigh in at twice the basic attacks of most infantry units, cold-blooded, of course, with a pretty good weapon skill of 3, so they're equal to that of most trained humans, and strength and toughness of 4, which means that while they're not ogre levels, they're stronger and tougher than your average human. And if you equip them with spears, well, they can fight in 2 ranks, which gives them a considerable amount of outgoing damage. However, here's the problem. They're lizard, they're cold-blooded, which while that means that they're not going to be breaking a whole lot, it also means that they're pretty slow to get going, and this is represented in tabletop by an initiative of 1. So they pretty much always strike last, unless they're fighting something like zombies, and they're pretty damn expensive. But this is more than made up for by the simple fact that Saurus warriors are probably the finest melee infantry in the game. Now, one-on-one, a Chaos Warrior might be the better fighter, but they're also slightly more expensive and a little rarer. In a Total War game, being a core unit, they should be readily recruitable, and you should potentially be able to field entire armies of these guys if you so choose, but of course if you do, well, you give up on every single form of ranged weapon available to you, and you've got no skirmishers. So while the Saurus warriors are pretty damn good at fighting in melee, leaving them completely exposed to the not-so-gentle administrations of various enemy ranged units might not be the best idea, as while they do have a shield and a relatively respectable armor save, they're still not going to be all that happy about sitting there getting pounded by 60-70 odd archers. And of course, since they don't have any form of ward save and are relatively expensive, they're not too happy with getting pounded by war machines. Now, as for their numbers, both the Saurus warriors and the skinks, skirmishers and melee skinks, should come in units of 120. The only real deviation should be if you're allowed to have Kroxigors in a unit of skinks, in which case you get like 5 or 6 Kroxigors in a unit of 100 skinks, circa-ish. Moving on to the special units, we have the Jungle Swarm. Now, this is essentially just a bunch of jungle creatures, various poisonous little bastards, poisonous toads, snakes, scorpions, all kinds of nastiness. They're not a particularly good fighting unit because, well, they're just a bunch of small critters, although they do pump out quite a few attacks per base, but they're low strength, and while you can upgrade them to be poisoned, they're essentially a bogging down unit. They're not going to be an effective meat shield, because they're not able to soak up artillery fire or ranged fire, because, well, they're tiny-ass critters. They're not going to be blocking line of sight to the Saurus warriors behind them. However, deploy them on a flank or something and have them eat a charge by cavalry or that kind of stuff. They'll bog them down for a good, nice long time. And they can be quite effective to just take the charge from enemy frontline infantry units and slow them down for long enough for your Saurus warriors to wade in there and, you know, at the very least, deprive the enemy of that charge bonus. As for their numbers, I would like them to be swarm things, so that you have 120-man strong unit, so to say, but every single model consists of a bunch of smaller models, meaning that the total size of the unit would be something like 400 or so. Of course, this might be quite taxing for your average computer, so I wouldn't be surprised if Creative Assembly decided to just not do the unit, because if they were gonna do it and do it justice, it'd be kind of problematic. And honestly, they do have a somewhat limited use. Moving on, we have the elite bodyguards of the Lizardmen faction, the Temple Guards, which are bigger, badder Saurus warriors. They have light armor, plus their scaly skin, and halberds, which puts their rather considerable strength of 4 all the way up to 5, the equal of that of an ogre. And as an added bonus, they're so damn scary that they cause fear, which is of course always an advantage. They cost a fair bit more than your average Saurus warriors, but they also hit a fair bit harder thanks to their halberds and their improved weapon skill. And they would be an amazing rock unit to have in the center of your army, to grind away at the enemy, and of course they make the absolute perfect bodyguard for your Slann, and since the Slann can still continue to cast spells while his unit is engaged in melee combat, being engaged with a unit of temple guards to the front with a Slann in it is essentially like fighting your way into a wall of pikes while there's a bunch of dudes with shotguns standing behind the lines of pikemen. So they are pretty damn nasty, to say the absolute least. They should be pretty damn expensive, though. I'd want you to recruit them, because, well, previously, they could only be in your army if they had a Slann, like they were considered to be the exclusive bodyguards of the Slanns. But if we want to limit the Slanns to 1, or maybe 2 or 3 total per your faction, that'd be a little gay, because you want temple guards. Temple guards are cool. You should be given 1 unit of temple guards at the beginning of the game to be a bodyguard for your original Slann, but after that, essentially you just need a really high tier building, and you can start recruiting them properly as normal units. Expensive as all hell, of course, but you should potentially be able to have an entire army of the bastards if you so choose. And they come in units of 120 because, well, again, elite infantry, but not broken infantry. Then we move on to something even more interesting, the Cold One Cavalry, which are, well, lizardmen riding velociraptors, essentially. Now, in this current edition, they're not that effective because of their really high price point. But this is of course something we can easily get around in a total war game. Like, being one of the relatively few proper cavalry units available to the Lizardmen, while they don't have the armor of most other elite cavalry units, they are Lizardmen riding velociraptors, and as such they are pretty damn powerful. And while a little bit slow, they still are relatively powerful cavalry, even more so if they can actually get the charge off. They should come in standard heavy cavalry units of 60, be relatively easily recruitable, tier 2 building or something along those lines. And of course, they make an absolutely excellent unit to put your Saurus Scar veteran or Old Blood in, to give you a proper Wrecking Ball unit. Something a little lighter, or considerably lighter in fact, we have the Terradon Riders. Now, this is essentially a light cavalry unit, despite the fact that, they fly. Depending again on how Creative Assembly actually implements flying, you could allow them to do a charging... You could allow them to do a flying charge, for example, which would make them excellent skirmish hunters and be able to take on other light cavalry relatively easily, but if you're allowed to just, charge any unit over intervening other units, they might quickly become ridiculously overpowered simply because they can just jump straight onto your war machines. So I would kind of prefer it if they were just ridiculously fast light cavalry where they fly, but they can still be engaged in melee combat, and they can't fly over intervening units. Now, I'd really like it for them to be able to make a short-range charge so that they can catch other light cavalry in skirmishes, but nothing so insane as they can just jump over units, because that'd be problematic. And while being a relatively large target, they do move at considerable speeds, and so should not be that easily to take out with missile fire. You're probably going to have to dedicate a fair few units of relatively fast-firing archers or something along those lines to cause them real damage. On the downside, of course, they are only skinks that ride them, and so while they are pretty good in melee combat, they are not automatically going to be winning a fight with other light cavalry. They're certainly going to be able to see off most skirmishes in all due likelihood, but, they're probably going to need a little bit of support if you're going to have them be your dedicated light cavalry hunters. As for unit size, I don't know. If we assume that other light cavalry is going to be relatively weak and come in units of about 80 or so, these guys should be about 80 themselves. If they come in smaller units, like 60, I'm kind of tempted to say that these should be bigger, simply because they're a bit weaker. But a basic unit size of 80 or 90 sounds about right. They shouldn't be able to take on a ranked up unit of infantry, and having a complete and utter lack of armor, they're probably not going to, so that's probably fine. However, they do have an upgrade called the Ripperdactyl Riders. Now, I'd kinda like for this to be an upgrade to the unit once it's gained enough veterancy, so to say, because it's essentially just a bigger, badder unit of Terradon Riders. They essentially fulfill the same role, except they're better at it. So, while the Terradon Riders might be struggling with light cavalry, the Ripperdactyl should be able to take on the vast majority of light cavalry, only really being challenged by dedicated elf light cavalry, that kind of stuff. And while they're still not going to be able to take on a ranked up unit of infantry to the front, if you've got a unit of enemy infantry tied up to the front with, for example, Saurus Lizardmen, and you charge it in the rear with Ripperdactyls, that should be a pretty damn dead unit. Now, seeing as they're considerably better at fighting, I think I'd like to see them in heavy cavalry sizes of about 60, to represent their slightly more elite status, so to say. But enough with these small flittery creatures, let's get on to something a little bit bigger, shall we? The Bastiladon. Now, the Bastiladon, as you might be able to tell from both its picture and its name, is a pretty damn tough little bastard with a +2 scaly skin armor save, but a relatively low toughness of 5. They will go down relatively easily to ranked up infantry units in a protracted fight. However, the Bastiladon's main objective is not to be melee fighting infantry. It's a tank, essentially. Being a wonderful flank guard for your nice big fat units of Saurus warriors, as well, there are very few infantry units or cavalry units even in the game that can actually get through a Bastiladon quick enough to help the friendly unit engage with the Saurus warriors. It has some upgrades which allows various magical engines to be placed on its backs. The most interesting one in Total War terms is probably the Arc of Sotek, which allows it to shoot a continuous stream of weak projectiles even when moving, which is a potentially interesting ability. If you let the Bastiladon essentially just continuously pump out a stream of relatively quick-firing, low-damage projectiles, kinda like it fires one arrow every second or something, kind of like a tower does in a settlement, and it continues to do this in melee combat. You could have a really cool unit, basically a tower on the battlefield that's just big, gnarly old creature that's mowing through your units, firing arrows and tying units down while supporting the Saurus warriors. Could lead to some really cool army composition. And they're not that hard to take down. Some artillery or a nice big unit of strong infantry will deal with it relatively simply, so I don't think it would be OP if you do that. Could be an interesting unit. Should probably come in units of, I'd probably say 3. Normally I'd say 1 or something like that. Yep, 1 for units of this size, but because it doesn't have that much of a melee attack, and because it's not actually that tough, yeah, I'd say 3 of them would be probably good. They'll start racking up a fair amount of damage with their arrow firing abilities if you actually let them just sit there shooting, but otherwise they're not that dangerous, and can be handled relatively easily if you actually just dedicate the units to taking care of it, while still being a fairly viable little support unit. So, yeah, 3 sounds good to me. Then, of course, we have the Kroxigors, which are giant two-legged crocodile people, and they are pretty damn strong, and wielding two-handed great weapons only makes them even stronger, allowing them to weigh in with a strength 7 attack with a base strength of 5. So, the Kroxigors are essentially the Lizardmen's dedicated anti-big guy units, and should probably come in units of about 60 or something. They are essentially your anti-ogres and that kind of stuff unit. And they'll deal with the most large enemy characters relatively easily, like even a Bloodthirster is probably going to have a bit of a problems going up against 60 Kroxigors, while other more elite anti-big guy units will deal with them relatively easily. Like, a unit of 5 Demigryph Knights will be relatively nasty against Kroxigors, though the Kroxigors do have the advantage of two-handed weapons, while as most ogres only have one-handed weapons. All in all, pretty simple unit to make, I think. Just, essentially a unit of ogres for the Lizardmen used to take out other big guy units. Relatively simple. Moving on, we have the Chameleon Skinks. Now, I'd kinda like these guys to be an upgrade to normal skink skirmishers, as they do essentially the exact same job, with higher ballistic skill, so they're a little bit better at shooting. And they come with poison as standard, so they're a pretty interesting little skirmishing unit, but they're less of a pure skirmishing cannon fodder unit than the skinks, because they can fire a bit more accurately, a bit quicker, and poison weapons are always handy. While, of course, these blowpipes are not going to be penetrating armor, the added expertise of the Chameleon Skinks would allow them to fire at weaker points in the armor, and have a bit more of an armor penetration than your average Skinks. Still shouldn't be great, but they'll deal better with a unit in heavy armor than the normal Skinks. Last of the special units, we have the always popular Stegadon. This is a rather beautiful little creature, if I am to say so myself, and is a rather excellent monster, really. Like, it's relatively good in melee combat, and while it's not particularly fast, due to its sheer mass, the sheer bulk of the creature, if this thing gets up into charging speed and slams into a unit head-on, well, the carnage will be absolutely exquisite. Additionally, it's got 5 skinks on its back, which are capable of doing some basic melee attacks while essentially just throwing javelins from its backs, and they operate the giant bow, which is essentially a ballista which can be fired on the move, although not very accurately. Unit size-wise, I think they should come in units of... I don't know with this one. I kinda wanna say 1, because they have such a ridiculous charge, but I think I'm probably going to go with 2. Because while 3 or 4 might definitively be fairly massive overkill, having just 1 of them feels like it's probably going to be really vulnerable to incoming artillery fire. So yeah, probably 2 of them sounds good. As if you can actually catch one of these units without letting it charge, it's not actually that tough. It's going to struggle in prolonged melee combat with enemy infantry units, especially units like ogres, for example, would absolutely beat the shit out of these guys if they could catch them. And even human units with halberds will be able to do a fair bit of damage to them. So they're a bit of a situational unit that really needs a bit of careful handling to get the most out of them, but that's kind of the charm of them too. Very powerful if you can actually use them, not so powerful if you, well, can't. And it also comes in Ancient Stegadon form. If you thought the basic Stegadon was pretty damn awesome, this guy is even better, as it is tougher, hits harder, and the skinks on top of it has switched out their little javelins for blowpipes, which gives them a little bit extra of a poison attack. It's a pretty damn good infantry killer, and it's still incredibly powerful to charge. And there is a special version that can be mounted by a skink priest, which allows it to use a so-called Engine of the Gods. Now, this little magical doodah gives 3 different effects. First of all, it gives all units within a relatively small area a +6 ward save, which isn't a whole lot to write home about, but, you know, handy. It can cast 1 bound spell that does 1d6 strength 4 flaming hits, so essentially he throws out a fireball, and he can boost the ability of the rest of your wizards to cast spells of 1 selected magical lore for 1 turn. In total war terms, I'd kinda prefer if this thing, it had a fairly large area of effect that just all friendly units within the area of effect gets a little bit tougher, just a straight up hit points or toughness boost. And instead of throwing just giant fireballs, it'd work kinda like the version mounted on the Bastiladon, essentially a bigger, badger arrow tower that fires, little balls of fire at about twice the rate of the Bastiladon. However, they should come in units of 1, because they're pretty damn awesome, and they kinda deserve to be in a unit of 1. They're a fair bit harder to deal with than your average Stegadon, because it's a hell of a lot tougher, which means that even if you do catch it flat-footed, it's still going to be one hell of a fight, so I think a unit of 1 sounds about right. And if you do put an engine of the gods on top of it, and you allow it to fire tiny little fireballs, like really fast-firing arrows, it would absolutely chew through enemy infantry units, so yeah, 1 sounds good. Moving on, we have the Salamander hunting packs. Now, these are essentially a bunch of salamanders that have been, well, more or less enslaved, really, by the Lizardmen to work as sort of light artillery. They fire globulets of poisonous goo at the enemy at relatively considerable range, everything considered, and they've got a reasonable high strength, which means that they're one of the few units within the Lizardmen army that are actually really capable of dealing with heavily armored units. Well, one of the few ranged units anyways. And they're a pretty damn amazing unit. They're essentially light artillery, so I'd kinda like to see them in units of 8, but that depends on how their attack works. In tabletop, they have an AoE attack, which if you give a unit of 8 of them AoE attack, then yeah, that wouldn't work. And if they need to be given AoE attacks, there should be about 4 of them. But I'd kinda prefer it if they fired kinda like ballistas, but really, really inaccurately. Like, you should be firing them at large blocks of enemy infantry, like the center of the enemy army, because, after all, they're just spitting this stuff at relatively long range, considering they're, well, spitting. And as such, they shouldn't be all that bloody accurate. But yeah, would be a really cool unit, just seeing like 8 of these little guys just vomiting poison all over the enemy. Could be cool. If you give them units of 8s, they'd be a little bit more visually interesting as well, as they're just throwing these globulets of poison at the enemy, and still be relatively effective as long as you target the center line of enemy units. They are by no means snipers. And they also come in a slightly different flavor with the Razer-don hunting pack. Now, instead of globulets of poisons, these guys essentially fire, well, spikes, and they fire quite a lot of them. So I'd like to see these units of about 4, with a well, if you want them to be effective, they should be relatively short range, where they can't really miss that much, but they should have the ability to fire at very long range, but they're not going to be hitting much. Essentially, at maximum range, they'll be kind of volley firing like archers, with just a ton of spikes being lobbed into the air to fall down rather haphazardly at any units you were kind of aiming at. So as a long-range artillery unit, they're not that effective, but they could be a really, really nice flank-guarding units, as you essentially put the little bastards on a flank and you dare the enemy to come and charge them, as you'll unload an absolute shotgun of viciously sharp spikes straight into them at point-blank range, where they're a hell of a lot more accurate. Last of the Lizardmen units, there is the Troglodon. Now, this one is a bit of a strange one, as in tabletop it's, well, pretty damn bad, because it's way too expensive for what it does. But in Total War terms, I think you can actually make a relatively cool unit out of this little bastard, because he's really, really damn fast. Essentially, I'd kinda like to see like a unit of... how many? I think I'd actually say 5, because while it looks scary, he's not actually that good in melee combat, and it doesn't really have any armor to protect it, and well, it's being ridden by a mere little skinky, so he's not that dangerous either. But have a unit of 5 of these, essentially be heavy monster cavalry, moving at really high speeds, and you've got an excellent anti-light cavalry unit. They're not going to be able to stand up to heavy elite cavalry, as the lancers will make an absolute joke of what little armor it actually does have. And while pretty large, it's going to struggle pretty damn hard in melee combat against any unit of elite heavy cavalry. But, like I said, if you make it really damn fast, and you just allow it to be a fast chargey unit, you can use it relatively effectively as a light cavalry hunter. And of course, being, like I said, relatively fast, you could use it essentially as a flanking unit, as a distraction or a skirmish hunter. It should be relatively cheap, simply because it's not going to be all that effective. Of course, if you get a flank charge on an enemy unit of heavy cavalry, they are going to do some real damage, but that's not their primary role, really. And being a Troglodon, you could always give it a bit of an aquatic special rule, which it's not technically quite correct, but still, I would really love to see the ability to terraform parts of the landscape. Like, this unit would be so goddamn amazing if you could give it the ability to go through swamps or river terrain, because you could essentially make one flank essentially unpassable for enemy heavy cavalry, and then send in this guy, which is, well, as far as light cavalry goes, this is probably the best anti-light cavalry unit you've got in the game, and if you have him be immune to marshes or rivers, it could be a really cool unit. But again, it really depends on what the guys over at Creative Assembly wants to do with all of it, so, you know, that's just my ideas and thoughts and various opinions on the matter. Well, that was all for the Lizardmen units. Now, a slight public service announcement all the way at the end if you've actually managed to get to this part. My entire family at this point is essentially getting sick, so I can already feel myself coming down with something too, so I'll try my best to get up the lore videos as usual, so if you've heard my voice being a bit strange today, then that is the reason, so be forewarned if next week's lore videos should fail to appear, so sorry about that. Anyways, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time, and have a good day.